Okay, so we've looked at several things that were in the beginning. We've seen God is in the beginning, and we have seen the creation days, the 6 days of creation, in which God created everything that's in the heavens and everything that's on the earth. You remember that God created everything to produce after its own kind. And I will argue that that leaves absolutely no room for evolution, the way that most people teach it today. That all the kinds have produced, that there was like one thing that produced everything eventually. That all the kinds came from one common ancestor way back. That totally conflicts with the assertion made in Genesis chapter 1 over and over that God created the plants and the animals, each in its own kind, to produce after its own kind. And we observe that today. That's exactly what happens. Animals and plants do not reproduce in any other kind than their own. And they were created that way from the very beginning. Humans are the same way. We reproduce after our own kind. That's what was created in the beginning. But I want you to go back. We're going to look back here at Genesis chapter 1, starting in verse 26, where God says, "Let us make man in our image." In the very beginning, we were created. Man was created in the image of God. What does that mean? Does that mean that God has arms and legs and two eyes, a nose, and a mouth like we do? Are we in his image that way? Or is there another way? Well, the Bible tells us that God is spirit. God is spirit. He does not have a body like we do. When Christ came to earth in the form of a baby, when he became incarnated, took on flesh, that was the first time that God had come in flesh, and he became a living human being. God and man together. But God is spirit. That is who he is. And being spirit, we are created in his image in a spiritual sense. We have spirits, we have souls, we have something invisible about us that is eternal in nature. God has created in us something that looks like him. Not only do we have this spirit, but we also have the character of God. We've been created to be moral creatures, to be able to choose good and evil. To choose good is why God created us, is to choose good, to choose him, to seek after him. This is something that the animals do not do. We have a special ability to appreciate beauty around us, to appreciate truth and virtue. Is that not a beautiful gift that God has given us? To be like him in these ways. And so he created us, and notice very clearly, male and female he created in his own likeness. He did not create the male in his own likeness and the female to be somehow inferior, but both of us, all of us, have been created in the image of God. Now, God gave us instructions in the beginning. So in the beginning there were rules, instructions. He gave us commands to follow, things to do. If you'll notice in verse 28 here, he says to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The first thing that he tells man to do is to have babies and have families and go out and fill the earth up with human beings. Not only are we to fill the earth, we are to subdue the earth. Subdue it. This earth is ours. It's been given to human beings to do something with. Not to wreck, not to wreak havoc, but to subdue it, to take control. Because, he says, you are to have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. God has given us dominion over this earth, and he tells us that we should take that responsibility very seriously. Then in chapter 2 and verse 15, if you go down with me, we haven't read this far yet, but if you go down to verse 15 of chapter 2, you see that the Lord took the man and put him in the garden to work it and keep it. So here is a responsibility, here is a work that man is to do. God put him in the garden for a purpose. We have a purpose to work the garden and tend it. And in verse 16, God said to the man, "You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die." Now, we have seen several things that God has told man to do: be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue the earth, have dominion over the earth, to work and tend the garden. And this is the first negative thing that God has told man: do not touch the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's the only negative command that God gave man at the very beginning. And so, what a wonderful life, right? There's only one rule: don't touch that tree, and everything else is free. Everything else is good and holy to go out and touch. Even the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is good and holy, but it's just off limits for humans to eat. We're not allowed to touch that. So that's the way it was in the very beginning. And then starting in verse 18, here's a little flashback to the days of creation, to the sixth day, in which God looked at the man and said, "You know what? It's not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper fit for him." And there's this beautiful, the man names all the animals. God brought every animal before the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man decided to call the creature, that was its name. He gave name to all the animals, but for Adam, there was not found a helper fit for him. And so God caused a deep sleep to fall on the man. And while he slept, he took one of his ribs from his side and he fashioned a woman out of this. He fashioned a beautiful woman, and he brought her to the man, and the man waxed eloquent with poetry. "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Jesus will hearken back to this scripture in the New Testament in Matthew chapter 19. And this is quoted several times in the New Testament. This is the way God created us to be: a man and a woman who are joined together as one flesh for life. And they make a new family. This is the rule. Now, you'll notice Adam and Eve are the first two human beings on the earth. But it says a man shall leave his father and his mother. This is the way God designed things to be. That a man should go out from his family, make a new family with a wife, with a woman. And that those two together will produce more kids and fill the earth to continue what God had told them to do. And notice the end of this chapter: "And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." That's significant. That is significant. Isn't this beautiful? The way God has created man to be from the very beginning. Now, I just want to review very quickly. What do we have at the Garden of Eden in the very beginning? What has God given as gifts to man? A close relationship with Him, with the Father, and a close relationship with one another. He created us for relationships. He gave us dominion over the earth. This whole earth is ours. And He gave us good, honest work to do in tending the garden. He gave us delicious fruit to eat and a paradise to live in, a Garden of Eden, a beautiful place, a perfect place. There in the garden was the tree of life, in which they could eat and live forever. In that garden, God created us to live, to have life. That's the way we were intended to be. And don't forget the rules that God gave even in the rules, there's great blessing, because God creates rules to guide us and keep us safe and keep us on the right track. So even in the rules, there's much grace. And at the end of his creation, remember, God saw everything that he had made, and he said, behold, it is very good.